Hi, Misha here, and it's a gray, cold day in early winter, late fall. So what better time to talk about some Soviet-Russian firearms? And this is one you've seen in more than a few videos. This is my so-called letter series Tula SKS-45, the Simonov. One of the last types they produced at Tula there. No one knows exactly what the 3 or so year codes mean on these, but it's speculated 56 to 58. But by the time these are being turned out, this rifle was kind of already on the decline and really being pettied away to foreign investors and interested parties. These letter series are pretty uncommon, pretty neat, and this is a good honest example I've had. And we were getting quite a few Russian SKSs in between 1992 and 1996, after the fall of the Soviet Union and before the bilateral trade agreement between Yeltsin and Clinton, their administrations, where Russia voluntarily said they wouldn't send military arms over here. So, for a while, Russian SKSs were pretty common and affordable, and you could just buy a lot of them or go to your gun store and sift through and find some interesting variations. These are typically have either KBI or Century Arms import marks. But as neat and as uncommon as the letter series Tula is, have one here that just, I would say came in, but it actually came in again because I owned this rifle about 10 years ago and traded it off to a friend for my 1950 SKS, and I don't regret it because that early one is really cool feature-wise and all matching. However, this is a pretty cool one too. This is an Izhevsk today Kalashnikov concern SKS-45. These are uncommon to rare. Now this isn't the rarest Izhevsk, but it is a nice one. It's mostly matching, has been refurbed, but it's a pretty light refurb with the original bluing intact. Original features. So in this video, I thought we would talk about why Izhevsk only made these for a year or less, and only made $250,000 or less. Kind of share my research that I've come up with. Everything is a little bit of speculation, but that's kind of part of the fun, isn't it? And just kind of what was going on during this very pivotal, very transitional period for the Soviet Union, the Communist bloc, and the Simonov design here. So if you enjoy such guns, please do like, share, and subscribe. And with that, we'll just get on into it. So I'm going to set this Izhevsk down for a minute and talk about what's going on at the factory at the end of the Great Patriotic War and the early Cold War period time. And of course, talking about this period in the Soviet Union, sooner or later, the Mosin comes around. Izhevsk was the main producer of a lot of Russia's firearms, Tula as well, but they had problems in late 1941 after Operation Barbarossa and the Germans getting close. But Izhevsk was far enough back that they were able to just keep cranking out guns. And in 1943, the war was turning in favor of Russia. It was still a hard-fought war for the next 2 years, but it was getting there. So you do have programs that would ultimately produce the 7.6239 cartridge, but you also had programs to just kind of update the Mosin-Nagant here. A little more, standard. The M38 Carbine was doing really well in the war. People liked them. but it didn't have a bayonet and really the ability to mount one. So it was felt, let's do a test batch of 50,000 M38s with pokey things, cruciform bayonets. And this would be made at Izhevsk. And it worked well, so very quickly, since it's the old school Mosin technology, the receivers, the tooling, everything used there, were put into high rate production, over 3.5 million in 1944, and nearly 3.5 million in 1945 at Izhevsk. And of the not quite 7.8 million, you see the first 2 years made up the bulk of this. But they would keep this in production 1946, 1947, even 1948 at Izhevsk, but they would build between about 125,000 and 190,000 per year. So just little supplementally, kind of keeping work up, just to have them type things, make work. Interestingly, though, in 1944, Tula would make a very small run of M44s, about 100,000. I am mentioning this for a point, not just a ramble, even though I am rambling. Of course, this is just your standard bolt action, firing 7.62 by 54 rimmed, Fox's favorite gun and round. So this is the main rifle that Izhevsk produced into the early Cold War era. But they stopped in 48 because a new time, a new era was dawning. But let's backtrack just a bit to talk about handguns. The Tokarev pistol, the TT-33, the Tula Tokarev. Obviously, these would be designed and manufactured at Tula. But remember how I mentioned a minute ago that the Germans were getting close in 41. In 42, they would move a lot of the tooling, machinery, personnel from the Tula factory. They've essentially evacuated an entire city-sized factory, a very impressive feat. And it would combine with elements of Izhevsk to make just a giant city metropolis of making guns. This is when the Germans should have realized they weren't going to win this. And so you start to see Izhevsk type Tula pistols being built. Heck, at this point, they're still making 1895 Nagant revolvers. But they would also continue Tokarev pistol production after the war. In fact, this is a post-war. That's why I have it. It has the small slide serration showing kind of the new tooling. Yes, it's got a safety. My other one doesn't, but what do you do? And they would keep making these primarily at Izhevsk into the 50s. Some say 53, some say 54. I've even seen 55 as a later date. But it was on the way out too. Of course, as far as 7.62 25 PT is a cartridge. Cool little round derived from the Mauser. Single action only. A simple, dependable gun that was made with milling tools of the time. So that was also taking up Izhevsk production capacity. Alright. You knew we were going to talk about Kalashnikovs because in 1949 at Izhevsk, and only Izhevsk in Russia, the AK was put into production. Type 1 as it were, stamped receiver, which would transition over to the first milled receiver, the Type 2, by 1951. And then in 1953 into 54, we would transition over to the Type 3, which was the one that really went gangbusters and was produced in large numbers and would even be exported. The Type 1s and Type 2s were never exported to foreign nations, at least as manufacturing goes. And this is actually a good one to talk about here because even though it's a kit build on a U.S. receiver, it was actually a transitional Type 2 to Type 3 gun based on the hardwood furniture. This is Arctic birch wood. Sorry for fans of Russian red. It actually was not in use at Izhevsk at this time. They were still using the more brown, blonde type. And it would be hardwood at this scope still. No laminate yet. Now, this is where things get interesting. I think there's a certain perception that the AK was the new great thing, and our SKS here was kind of old news. This is the Tula again. That's not at all the truth. In fact, both guns were designed at exactly the same time because it was part of a program begun in 1944 to make a rifle, essentially a submachine gun, although we would call it an assault rifle today, and a light machine gun for the new cartridge. And while, yes, the Kalashnikov took the submachine gun / assault rifle slot, they still didn't know what to call it at this time, it was the Simonov rifle here that took that slot. And this was, you know, a development of his SVT-40 and all of that. And it is. It's a more traditional gun. Fixed 10-round mag, machined receiver, 20-inch barrel, and of course a folding blade bayonet. Now, the Tula factory would be the one that primarily produced these. And yes, the earliest ones in 1949 would have a cruciform spike bayonet, but that would very quickly go to the blade. Talk about rare guns, that's another very rare variant, 1949 Tula in the SKS world. So that was meant to be the long-range kind of aimed fire rifle, with the select fire Kalashnikov being the close-in, you know, bullet hose to kind of replace the Papa Shaw and other subguns. That's why it didn't actually get its bayonet. And I guess I picked up an East German. It's still my Russian. Oh well. And it is cold out here. There we go. But around 1951, with the Type 2, this bayonet style was kind of clutched on the gun. It works, but yeah. And that's because by this point, they're kind of realizing, hey, you know, this gun with a 16-inch barrel, and now we're going to a machined receiver, we're not really losing much over the SKS. So the original idea of needing two, one for each roll, wasn't really bearing out. But effectively, the SKS kind of became the backup plan. This was cutting-edge tech, especially the Type 1. Going to the Type 2 kind of reversed that a bit, getting away from early stamped receivers. So that helped, but it still was detaching mags and all of that. And they had problems. We think of the AK as bulletproof and reliable. And really that reputation did not come in until the AKM in 1959. The Type 1s had production issues, and the Type 2s, well, they were a little too fiddly to produce and whatnot. And the Type 3s were a lot better, especially on a manufacturing thing. But they still had some deficits. The mags were heavy, not always the most reliable, denting, lost, and they weren't very controllable in automatic fire. So the SKS still had its zone. So that's why Tula focused on building these. They never made the original AK-47, and they would produce over 2.5 million between 1949 and, say, 1958. But now we can finally talk about the weird little blip on the radar that is the Izhevsk SKS-45. When did these go into production? Well, this is all kind of based on speculation. We don't 100% know, but it seems to be in the second half of 1953, even towards the end. And it only ran through 1954, probably not even that full year. In fact, it's speculated that Izhevsk made SKSs for under 12 months, with the bulk being 1955 1954. So this one's the more common year. I'd say you probably find more than 10 to 1 54s over 53s in Izhevsk SKSs. On the other hand, you probably find even less than 10 to 1 of these compared to a Tula. Because, well, Tula made well over 2.5 million, and we don't know how many Izhevsk made. It really is speculated that it would be under 250,000, maybe 100,000. And that kind of gets back to what I mentioned earlier about Tula making M44s during the war, but only about 100,000. And it also just kind of gels with their yearly production. And they were still making the AK, but this was that period of transitioning from the Type 2 to the Type 3. Maybe some had doubts. But the nice thing is with this, they really didn't have to tool up. The SKS used the same tool set as the Type 2, Type 3 Kalashnikov. Not so much the Type 1, but this is a milled receiver. By this point, the barrel was chrome lined. And the furniture is the same type of Arctic birch. Now, originally, all Izhevsk guns would come out of the factory with hardwood. Now, in refurbishment, they would sometimes be given laminate stocks. Truthfully, Tula did not start shipping guns brand new out of the factory with laminate stocks until 1955, even 56. So only late Tulas would have come out with laminate. Most SKSs from Russia with laminate stocks, they were added during refurbishment, which, you know, they kept the guns in thing, and it was kind of a make-work thing to keep guns in good repair. If you see that square, that box with the hash in it on a Russian gun, that means it went through, at the very least, inspection and probably repair replacement of any worn, damaged parts. And that's kind of, I think, the key, make-work. Izhevsk might have had leftover capacity, and hey, let's build some SKSs over in that corner. As they were switching AKs from versions, they probably had to slow down to let old parts get used up, getting in the new parts. They had the capacity, and the Soviet Union kept their workers going and busy. And at this point, too, they were exporting more and more to communist allies. For example, the Mosin-Nagant was exported to China in 1953 as the Type 53, where they'd make their own. You see Poland and Hungary following suit. And at this point, they are getting more in line with exporting the SKS. First, they're just going to sell or give their guns away. But by 1956, they are actually exporting the production line. Romania has the M56, China the Type 56, and then of course Yugoslavia would get them in 1959 as a gift. And this is when we start to kind of see the AK taking over. Even though they were both put into production in 1949, they were kind of running neck and neck. They were proponents of both. But by 1954, the AK was clearly the future. That's not to say the SKS was bad, but it was just inherently a more conservative design. And the Russian armed forces, the squadron, the platoons, were going more and more mechanized, in fact. So with that, why did I trade this off? Why did I get it back? And what am I planning to do with it? Well, that kind of gets into me being blind. I think markings are neat in the abstract, but I can't see them. I can feel there's markings here, but that's about it. I'm a features guy. And I had picked this up about a decade ago at a local shop. I knew that Izhevsk SKSs were far less common than Tula. And this one is nice because it seems to have its original bluing. And comparing on the table, Tula top, Izhevsk below. While 1953 Izhevsk guns may have some middle features like Tula, by 54 it seems like they were looking identical to a late production Tula, at least in the broad strokes. Both are very nicely blued guns. They have the same style of magazine and trigger guard. They both have the small lightning cut on the sight. The gas block is very similar. It is actually machined just a little bit different, but there are a ton of variations in SKS gas blocks. Both bayonet lug mounts have the lightning cut, and the front sight base is pretty well identical too. And the flip over, both have almost identical takedown arms there, slightly different in the indent versus this. The safety, virtually identical with the ribbing on the back, step in the trigger guard. The takedown for the gas tube is a little different. This has the lip, the ledge on it still. This is the later completely flush style. The checkering on the Tula for the cocking handle is a little more pronounced than on the Izhevsk. Mounts and everything look very, very similar. Front sight base included. Fun fact, even after Tula switched to the blade bayonet, for a couple of years they blued it, and then they would go to the polished bayonet. And originally these would have bolt carriers in the white. Refurbishments would change that, and they would have a quite high grade blued finish. Later, of course, refurbishment would replace that with paint. And the Izhevsk guns are known for being very high quality. There's very good machining, very smooth. Very smooth. Actually, very nice trigger on this one. Very high quality. So most of what makes these unique, it's in the markings. And that 1951 I traded for, it has the early features, and that's what I don't regret the trade. But there are a few kind of interesting things. Some of the earlier Izhevsks will have a slightly earlier style trigger group, and you'll sometimes find transitional things like the bayonet assembly. Lightning cuts on this one, but the angle cuts can be a little different on the Izhevsks. But for the most part, they are identical to a mid-production Tula. And with bayonet deployed, the mounts seem virtually identical. Some might say the angle here is a little bit different, but I don't know. This has a more shiny blade. This is more matte. That could have just been done in the refurb program, or it could just be that the blades are a little more matte. And it could even be a variation gun to gun. I've seen that before. Just because one gun has a feature doesn't mean every gun's that way. So, but it's the same bayonet. I mean, any differences are just very, very small. Which, hey, if you're into that, cool. I can definitely be a micromanager too. But for me, for my money, the Izhevsk has the same feature set as a equivalent year production Tula. So really it just comes down to the markings. So what I plan on doing with this now, honestly, it'll probably move along to a new home. Because there's just a lot of collector interest in these, and there's always other things. But But it's neat, and I wanted to do a video with it to show you guys, because I think production of the SKS at Izhevsk is just an interesting little blip in history. And with that, why did it end? Why was it so brief? Honestly, at this point, even Tula is scaling back SKS production. Going over to Izhevsk, as I mentioned, the pistol, the Tokarev, is at the end of its run. And as early as 1952, production is switching over, slowly but surely, to the new Makarov PM pistol. Now, this was a very slow transition because this is a relatively low priority target. So it would actually last until 58, 59 before this finally hit full scale. But work development on the Makarov was primarily done at Izhevsk and production. So this was a new project. Just to compare the wood finish and the bluing, here are the Izhevsk produced guns. Well, at least half produced in that case. Kind of lined up on the table. You can really see the continuation on the wood styling at this point. Even the bluing. As much as Russian guns kind of get a reputation for being crude, they really weren't. Even the Makarovs and Tokarevs are kind of cool in their own ways, I think. It's funny to me that people want a wartime M44, 1944, 1945, but again, that's most all of them, but I get it. On the other hand, people have always recognized that Izhevsk SKSs are uncommon, and although it does seem like more of them came into America than have been sent to Canada. Flip side of that is it seems like Canada got more of the 1949 Tulas, so I don't know how I like about that bargain. And of course, it's not legal and hasn't been since 1968 to import machine guns for the civilian market, so the guns we have here are all kit builds, primarily the PLO Israeli sold ones, and they will all be Izhevsk, Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 out of Russia. No Tulas. Refurbished mag, but gives you the idea. And like I said, I just happened to grab an East German bayonet. By the way, this bayonet was actually derived from the SVT-40. Waste not, want not. Keep the workers working. The AK is just coming into its own, just maturing. In 1955, in fact, were the earliest rumblings of testing and trials and specifications for its next generation. And even though this process would take a few years, in 1959, we would get the AKM, which, yes, primary production would begin at Izhevsk. But now Tula would get involved, which is, they're shutting, that's probably why they shut down SKS production finally in 1958 too. They're both making AKMs. This is the future. Also, I should just mention briefly that the RPK was developed at Izhevsk at this period, the mid to late 50s, even if it was produced at what we know today as Molat. So they're getting busy, and this is just small arms. There are plenty of other things going on. So there was that lull in the early to mid-50s, but the lull was over, and now they've really figured out the assault rifle. That's why I kind of referred earlier to this as a submachine gun. A lot of nations, not just Russia, tried to kind of pigeonhole this type of gun as a submachine gun, but then they realized, you know what? It is more like a rifle, just with bonus features. So we don't really need more traditional carbines. This also happened in the West, and is part of firearms development history. And, also I would mention probably lessons learned following the Korean War. That was also around the same time period, so you have to think about how much impact that might have had. Since this came back into my possession, at least briefly, traded with a friend at the range, actually on Black Friday, I thought, yeah, let's do a little video here. Not so little, but really deep dive. I enjoy studying these things. Sometimes there are guns that I want to keep. Sometimes there are guns I just really enjoy studying. And for me, this is just a study one because of the history. But tell me what you'd do. Would you keep it? Or would you move it along? Keep in mind the market now, kind of up there. Also, this is a good example. Very clean gun, nice bluing. But it has been reworked, refurbished. Not at all uncommon for an Izhevsk. In fact, it's very hard to find a 1954 non-refurbished, non-replaced any parts gun. Which means finding a non-refurbished 1953 is the pretty much holy grail of Russian SKS collecting, maybe outside of a 1949 all-original Tula. But other than that, yeah. This one, it's mostly matching. Bolt carrier, top cover, receiver, even the trigger pack. But then it has a non-matching, although still Russian, mag, and the stock has had creative things done to it. But replacement stocks are very common. And that's kind of how the Russian refurbishment would work. People often think of refurbed Russian guns, be they K98s, Mosins, as having that thick black paint and the kind of rushed shellac job. And they absolutely can. But they would only do that and only replace parts and do the electrical pencil renumbering if it needed it replaced. If not, they just leave it alone. In fact, there are some guns that look completely untouched except they have the inspection square on the stock, which just basically means someone looked at it and went, that's a good gun, there's nothing wrong with it, move it along. It just meant it was inspected, improved, and boom, there you go. But usually they found something wrong. A lot of times it is the stocks. And sometimes you'll see a new barrel put into a gun. So, there it is. And there's a lot of cool stamps and inspector marks on Russian guns that, unfortunately, I just can't take advantage of. Really is a very nice trigger on this for what it is. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you do, what you think. And as always, please do like, share, and subscribe. I know these historical videos are, not everyone's cup of tea. But as long as you've been watching this from the warmth of wherever you're at, I'm out here and my hands are basically numb. It's not warm. So there's that. So I appreciate you tuning in. If you could at least like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to, check out Patreon. Support us on there. But I'd love to talk SKSs and, your collection and what you think down below as well. This is Misha. And I'm going to go in and warm up my hands. So, catch you very soon next time.